أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الأول قبل الإنشاء والإحياء والآخر بعد فناء الأشياء العليم الذي لا ينسى من ذكره ولا ينقص من شكره ولا يخيب من دعاه ولا يقطع رجاء من رجاه وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وبارك على محمد وآل محمد وترحم على محمد وآل محمد كأفضل ما صليت وباركت وترحمت على إبراهيم وآل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد فعال لما تريد عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله عز وجل واتباع أمره واجتناب نهيه. One of the issues that our society is currently plagued with, and something that we have to pay attention to, is the issue of hypercriticism. And what I mean by that is what we usually refer to a person being hypercritical is a person who criticizes people too much without really having the justification to criticize that person. So basically, trying to find faults in other people, but in an extreme way. And ever since people have become more active on social media platforms, and there's many nowadays, we realize that it's become much easier to become critical people. And I don't mean to say that criticism is not a good thing. To be critical naturally in a balanced manner is a good thing. You have to be self-critical. That's how you improve yourself. You look at your faults and you try to fix those faults. If you're not critical of yourself, then you overlook your faults. You overlook your mistakes. You end up justifying everything you do, and you end up developing a very bad character because these bad habits that you have end up becoming ingrained in you because you keep performing them and there's nothing that's stopping you when you realize that they're bad. So being critical about yourself is very important. Being critical about other people as a society, if we're looking at, let's say, public issues, criticizing, let's say, the politicians because you want to improve the society, not just criticizing them for the sake of criticizing. That means that these politicians see that there are people who are objecting to certain types of behavior. It puts pressure on them, and it pushes for change. So criticism naturally is a necessary component for a healthy community and a healthy individual. But just like everything, anything that goes beyond its healthy and natural degree turns from something positive into something negative. And having access to this social media world and these platforms and being behind the screen makes it much easier for an individual to criticize other people without really thinking about what they're doing or what they're saying. So we see that a lot of times. Somebody posts something, somebody says something. The amount of negative comments that a person receives for something very basic is really surprising and shocking. Most people, if they were facing that person in real life, not behind the screen, they might not express that criticism to them. But because it's behind the screen, it's much easier to type anything. And the problem is the more you do it, the more addicted you become to it. It becomes a disease and an ailment. Once you start criticizing somebody and you see that there's no repercussion and you don't get a reaction from that individual, then you find it, oh, this is something that I can do and I'm not going to be affected by it in a bad way. And unfortunately, one of the spiritual ailments and spiritual diseases that religion, and specifically Islam, has talked about is being careful when it comes to the faults of other people. Because Islam, as a religion that believes in the soul, and as a religion that is very well aware of the diseases of the soul, teaches us that the soul loves to criticize other people because this feeds the ego. When you put someone else down, it elevates you above them. That's what it basically means, right? When I put someone else down, it means I'm telling myself and telling that person that, hey, this is something that's wrong with you, and because I'm a better person, I'm able to realize it, and I'm pointing it out to you. And the problem is, because it feeds the ego, if you allow it to happen without placing boundaries on it, then the more you feed the ego with it, the more satisfaction it gains. So you start doing it more and more and more. And eventually, you start overlooking your own faults. Because we have two things that are happening here. When we boost our ego, that's the first thing that's happening. The effect of boosting our ego is that we begin to diminish seeing our own faults. Because when the ego starts growing, it starts seeing itself more perfect, more better, and therefore it starts not seeing its faults anymore. So there are two problems that occur over here. If we look at the ahadith that the prophets and the imams alayhum salam have told us or made us wary of, we realize that they were very well aware of the situation and they didn't want the believers to fall into it. Now, there's a book that's been translated into English. It's a section or a chapter of Wasa'il al-Shia. Wasa'il al-Shia is a big encyclopedia of ahadith written by or compiled by one of the scholars named Al-Hurr al-Amili. He passed away hundreds of years ago, but he compiled an encyclopedia, and in one of the chapters, or one of the books that he had, it was Kitab Jihad al-Nafs, which is the combat with the self or of the self. In this book, which has been translated into English, and I recommend everybody to get a copy of this and to read it, Sheikh Bahjat, may Allah have mercy on his soul, used to recommend that everybody look at this book and have it with them, at least on a daily basis, to read one hadith from this book. It's a book that teaches how to overcome yourself and how to perfect yourself from the ahadith of the Prophet and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhum salam. One of the hadiths is narrated by Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, and this is under the chapter title, The Divine Recommendation to Occupy Oneself with One's Own Faults Rather Than Finding Faults with Others. Imam al-Baqir, peace be upon him, narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said, there are three qualities that, should a human possess them, or even if one of them can be found in him or her, on the day of judgment, they will be allowed to stand in the shade of Allah's throne, apart from which there will be no other shade. They are that he should do unto others only that which he would have them do unto him. So that's the golden rule, right? You do unto other people what you wish them to do unto you. This is a universal principle that we have to follow. That he does not so much as walk in front of a person or behind him except with the knowledge that it is for the pleasure of God. This is the second rule. That whenever you perform something, even if it's a very simple act, that you always try to find the pleasure of God in that act that you're performing. And the third rule, he says, or the third quality, is that he does not find a fault with his brother until he has removed the fault from himself first. And no sooner does he remove that particular fault from himself than he becomes aware of another fault, such that he contents himself with finding fault in himself rather than with other people. So, if we want to find a balance, we have to see the amount of criticism we have of other people. How many times do I criticize others per day? Whether it's on social media or whether it's my daily life. If I criticize my parent, or I criticize my child, or my spouse, or my sibling, or a friend, how many times compared to criticizing others do I criticize myself during the day? And if you just look at that, you might get an idea of where you stand in this situation. Am I overcritical? Am I overlooking my own faults and mistakes? Sometimes it's very right the fault that you see in the other person is correct. That person does have that fault. See, the Prophet in this hadith is not saying don't make up faults in other people. He's saying these are actual faults. So when you see another person making a mistake or they have a fault in themselves, the Prophet is talking about that real fault in them. He's not denying that they have faults in themselves. They do have mistakes. But before looking at their mistake, look into yourself. Do you have that same mistake and that same fault inside of you? If you do, then you don't have the right to criticize the other person because you yourself have not rid yourself of that problem. And once you do that, the Prophet says then you start becoming more aware of your other faults that are inside of you. And this is something that makes you aware of yourself. And suddenly, you realize that I have so many faults and I'm so imperfect that by the time I fix myself, my life would end before me being allowed to criticize or find other people's faults. And if we live in this kind of way, we would have a much healthier society. And honestly, the culture that we have on social media platforms that allows for this hypercriticism creates a very negative ambience. And it starts classifying people into certain groups and categories. And it becomes hard for us to become more friendly with others. You start finding people criticizing someone as soon as they say something that they don't like. That creates a group. And then you have a subgroup. And then you have a subgroup. And you start realizing that humans in this sense start feeling that they're unable to cooperate with other people. And, the culture that we've developed, which is termed as like the cancel culture now, with its benefits, because as we said at the beginning, criticism is a good thing. If somebody says something wrong, especially something that affects the masses, someone on the level of a politician, someone as an actor, someone who has influenced other people, it's good to criticize them when they say something wrong because their mistake goes beyond what a regular person's mistake goes to, right? If it's a celebrity, what they do, it will influence millions of people if they have that big of a following. So it's good to put these people in place so that wrongness doesn't spread in society. But at the same time, we have to have that balance. If we're hypercritical about everything, then we won't really settle with the truth anywhere. A lot of the times, we become so centered on our opinion. We become self-righteous. It's good to see wrong in other people. But it's also important to be aware of the wrong in yourself and in your opinions. And we change opinions all the time. One day I might believe something, and the next week or the next day I might change my opinion. So you have to have that humility as well. Before always trying to find the wrongness in the opinions of others, understand that you yourself might have that opinion or a different opinion than what you have right now. So when you want to say something, you have to be very careful. You have to be balanced with your approach. You have to be wary of how to word your criticism. Don't just put that other person down and consider their opinion to be absolutely false and absolutely wrong. You may present your arguments. You might say that I differ in my opinion. And that type of language that you use affects your mentality and affects that general well-being of the society as well. So we try to be positive in our approach instead of always trying to be negative and being self-righteous. That will make you aware of your own self, creates humility in you so that whenever you are approached with truth, you can accept it. You don't deny it just because it differs from what you think. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to realize this and to help us find our own faults before looking for the faults of other people. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. I will begin the second part of the sermon with a concept that we must be aware of nowadays, especially in the events that are occurring in the world, and specifically what's happening in Palestine. It's very unfortunate that humanity still is at a time where such massacres could occur before their eyes. And it continues to occur. After a little break that there was, people were able to breathe again. People were able to enjoy life with its hardship, of course, and difficulty, but they were able to be relieved to a certain degree. Yet now it begins to resume and to continue. It is our responsibility as human beings, and especially as believers, to stand against injustice wherever we can, no matter who it's performed upon, no matter who is suffering from this injustice. As a believer, we have to stand with those who are oppressed. Now, when God in the Quran states and tells the Prophet that this religion that I'm giving you is going to outshine all other religions, is going to outshine all other faiths, what's meant by that, in one meaning, in one sense, is that a Muslim should outshine everyone else in his and her behavior and approach to things in this world. That means that a Muslim should be someone who goes beyond their own identity. A Muslim should be someone who goes beyond their own culture, beyond their own group, beyond their own limitation. This is part of what outshining means. And the Prophet came with this message, specifically telling people that there is no difference between a white person and a black person except through piety. There is no difference between a person of a certain culture and another culture except through piety. No difference between, and the Prophet specifically used Arabs and non-Arabs at that time. And this is supposed to elevate people beyond racial identities, beyond cultural identities, because human beings tend to fall into this problem. We tend to belong to a culture, belong to a race, belong to a group, and we see that group or that race or that culture as superior and better than others. And what Islam came to do is it came to eliminate that. So when we see that there's injustice happening, we shouldn't only stand against the oppressors, let's say, or with the people who are being oppressed only when they're part of our own group. This is something that we have to reflect upon. Nowadays, there is a specific group that's being oppressed. They're not just Muslims. They're not just Arabs. There's a lot of people being oppressed, a lot of different groups that are being oppressed at that time, at that place. Christians are being oppressed. Muslims are being oppressed. Even some Jews are being oppressed. So we as Muslims have to stay strong. And we have to be able to stand with those who are oppressed no matter what creed they belong to, what religion they belong to, where they are, and what they're doing. So, and I think that when it comes to seeing these situations, the pain that we're feeling should act as a mover inside of us to make us reflect upon ourselves. Are we ourselves committing any type of injustice as well? Most of the time, when we see other people performing a type of injustice, we are very quick to call it out. But when we're performing the injustice, we tend to overlook that. And when our emotions are with the situation, with what people are going through, I think it's a very good time for us, in order to eliminate injustice, is to play a small part in trying to eliminate the injustice that we perform onto others in our own lives. And this is something that religion has emphasized as well. In one of the verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُونُوا قَوَّامِينَ لِلَّهِ شُهَدَاءَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَنْ لَا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ. O you who believe, be steadfast for God, bearing witness to justice, and let not hatred for a people lead you to be unjust. Be just, that is nearer to reverence. Don't let the hatred of some people towards you make you as an unjust individual. Even if the person who is harming you is someone who hates you, someone who's done wrong onto you, it does not justify you oppressing that individual. As a believer, you have to be just even with your own enemies. This is how the Imams were, and we have many stories like this. One story that is quite famous, a hadith that is both in the Sunni and Shia texts, related to Imam Ali alayhi salam. When he was a caliph, he was the governor of the Muslim nation at that time, so he had all the power in his hands. And there was a Jewish man who the Imam saw walking wearing his armor. The Imam had lost a piece of armor one day. Now the hadith, they differ in details, just where he lost it or, but it's not important. The point of the story is that the Imam had lost a piece of his armor, and this man had taken it. He was a Jewish man. And the Imam was a caliph at that time. So the Imam tells this man that this is my armor, and it belongs to me. And I have lost it, and you've taken it. The Jewish man, he denied it. He said, no, this is mine. I acquired this. So the Imam said, okay, let's go to a judge, and the judge will resolve this matter. So imagine the Imam is the caliph at the time. The judge is appointed by the Imam himself. So he's under the Imam's authority. Yet the Imam, knowing that this is his, obviously Imam knows it's his armor, and he knows that this person is lying. But he didn't use his power as a caliph, as a governor, to take this rightfully owned piece of armor to himself. He said we have to do this in a just manner. And how is that? We have to go to court. We go to the judge, and the judge, they stood before him, the Imam stood, the Jewish man stood, and he told the Imam, do you have any evidence that this is yours? Do you have any witnesses that could testify that this is yours? The Imam alayhi salam brought his son, Al-Hasan alayhi salam, and he brought another person. Now, again, the hadiths differ in the details of who was brought, but the judge didn't accept the testimony of Imam Hassan because he said that this is your son, and he cannot be used as a witness. So the judge ruled in the favor of the Jewish man. He told him that the armor is yours because the Imam couldn't produce two witnesses. So as soon as the Imam left the court, the Jewish man was surprised. He said that this is the governor who appointed this judge. He has the power to take this armor from me by making one order and one command. Yet, he decided to go on this route. And he lost the case, knowing that I am the liar and he's the truthful one. But he accepted it because this was the just manner. This is how the Prophet said that the courts have to function, and the Imam obeyed the Prophet's command, and he performed what is just. So even if someone is oppressing you, even if someone is doing wrong to you, you have to be just with them no matter what the situation is. And this happens a lot in our communities, especially when we have disputes. One of the disputes that is common is a divorce. When two people get into arguments, they no longer can live with one another, they apply for divorce. They somehow see that just because I hate that other individual, I have problems with that other individual, I have the right to treat them unjustly. When it comes to child custody, for example, one parent decides to keep the child away from the other parent. One parent decides to kidnap the children and go with them and deprive the other parent from them. And they justify it because they have hatred towards that individual and they have problems. Sometimes they use the child as a pawn to take revenge from that other spouse. And this is wrong. We have to understand that no matter how much you hate that other person, and no matter how much that person hates you, no matter what wrong they did to you, it doesn't justify that you behave unjustly towards them. It's very difficult to maintain this level of justice. But this is what we're ordered to do. And if we look at the hadith, we're really warned by the Prophet and the Imams about people who call for justice, yet they themselves don't apply this justice in their own lives. I'll quote one and two hadiths for you that talk about this. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says, "Indeed, the most unfortunate of people on the day of judgment will be the one who admired and praised justice, yet behaved contrarily to it." In another hadith, the Imam says, "The person suffering the most grief on the day of judgment will be the one who admired and praised justice, yet behaved contrary to it." So if you admire justice, if you call for justice, if you see that someone is doing something wrong towards their children or towards children in general and you condemn it, you have to see yourself. How are you treating your children? Are you taking the children away if you're in a divorce from their parent or their spouse? Are you performing that injustice on your ex and on the child as well? And this is something that we have to be wary of. When we talk to our children, do we put them down? Do we criticize them? Are we disrespectful? This is being unjust towards the child because the child has the right to grow in a healthy manner. The child has the right to grow as a strong individual, and that child needs the support of the parent. So when you have authority over a child, it's even more incumbent upon you to be just towards them, to show kindness, to show love, to allow them to enjoy a life of goodness in this world. Why should they grow up thinking that they have self-esteem issues? Why should they grow up thinking that they're not good people? Why should they grow up thinking that they're failures in this world? Just because you have some miserable personality or some problems in your life, or you've been treated in a non-proper way, it doesn't give you the right to pass that on to your child. And the same thing goes to your spouse as well. You have to be very just with your spouse. Some people justify, if it's a man, this is how you have to treat a woman this way. If you don't make the woman submit to you, then you're not going to live happily. This is something that Islam doesn't agree with. And the same thing the other way. Just because it's a different gender doesn't allow us to have whatever conviction that we have about them and exercise that conviction on them. I must treat them miserably in order and women love to be treated in a bad way. This is what they're looking for. So we create these ideas in order to justify the wrongness that we have. And the same thing goes the other way as well. Islam, of course, taught us to have healthy relationships. It taught us that human beings are able to have and maintain healthy relationships. Yes, you could raise a child by beating them, and they would become obedient. And at the same time, you can raise a child by showing them love and support, and they could become obedient. You could have the outcome in both ways. But the psyche of the child differs in each case. And the same thing with the spouse. You could have a spouse that's obedient, whether it's a man that pleases the woman or the woman that pleases the man, by showing love and respect towards that other spouse. You could also have obedience by being a dictator in the house. But there's different outcomes, not the obedience, but the psyche of the individual differs. One is a healthy relationship. You have an obedient, loving individual who you grow with. And the other one is that you have a subject that just listens to you, but you make them devoid of their humanity. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our hearts and minds to realize any injustice that we perform towards other people and help us change that to the better. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil Muhammad wa ajil.